And the Eastern Europeans are very apprehensive about that, and I would say for good reason. I also, so that's an interesting commentary on the opinions of people who have actually moved to the West. The people who've lived through this see the same thing happening again. And then on your comment about the top-down versus bottom-up model of totalitarianism, might have been, I wouldn't say exactly a flaw with Orwell's 1984, because you're hard-pressed to describe that book as flawed in any way, but I think also because we knew of the Stanford prison experiments, and also we're looking for an easy explanation for what happened in Nazi Germany, that it's comforting for people to believe that a totalitarian state is basically made up of people yearning to be free, who are oppressed, but basically honest, by a small minority of people willing to use coercion and terror. And there is a small minority of people willing to use coercion and terror. However, in a true totalitarian state, and this is Solzhenitsyn's genius, the totalitarian element of that is actually the willingness of every single person, virtually without exception, in the entire society to lie about everything all the time to absolutely everyone. Themselves, their wife or husband, their children, their parents, their siblings, the people they work with. And so it is, and this is something that reading Solzhenitsyn really convinced me of, and of course part of the reason I was attracted to your book, it is the idea that the route to totalitarianism at the individual level is the willingness to knowingly falsify your speech and perception and action. To knowingly do it too, not just to do it by accident, but to know it's wrong and still do it. That's the pathway to hell.
Yeah, you know, Joan, Czesław Miłosz, who was a former communist who defected from Poland in the 1950s, wrote an excellent book in the early 50s called The Captive Mind. And in it, he tried to describe to the West why people fell for communism. And he said that a lot of people in the West have this false idea that people did it solely because they were coerced. He said, in fact, there is among everybody, it's part of our human nature, this deep internal longing for harmony and happiness. A lot of these people in Eastern Europe, yeah, they were invaded by the Soviets who occupied them after the war, but a lot of them were exhausted by the war, and they thought communism would give them a sense of wholeness. It would give them a sense of meaning and purpose to their lives, and so they submitted to it. Also, Anne Applebaum, who's a historian of the Iron Curtain, said that most people in this part of the world, because I'm coming to you now from Budapest, most people in this part of the world didn't make a conscious deal with the devil to embrace communism. They were just tired and worn down by constant propaganda and just wanted to have a normal life. And if that meant having to submit to the lies, well, they were willing to do so.
Well, so there's another element of that that's interesting as well. So we could go two directions on that. The first is that under many conditions, the human proclivity to go along with the dictates of the group is actually an admirable proclivity. And so, you know, parents of teenagers often say to their teenagers, well, if your friends jumped off a bridge, would you jump too? And the answer to that is actually generally yes. And to make it even more complicated is that that's exactly what teenagers should be doing, because they should be substituting integration in the peer group for dependence on the parents. And so whether or not they fit in is of cardinal importance to a teenager who's developing properly. And so people should go along with the crowd in some sense, because that's what it means to be civilized into a broad community. The problem with that is that sometimes the crowd is a mob, and sometimes society has gone off the rails. And so then what do you do? And the answer to some degree is, well, you develop past being a teenager into an autonomous individual who's an autonomous contributor to the group, and then hopefully you have enough, what would you say, moral integrity to stand for what you see and think when you're called upon to do that. But we don't know the preconditions that allow people to do that. And then on the communist front, I would say, so you talked about people being worn out. There is also that, and this is one of the things that distinguished communism from Nazism, let's say, and made it even maybe more pernicious. The Nazis basically said, well, the world, that's for the Aryans, and the rest of you can go to hell, and we'll be happy to aid in the flames, let's say. And there's not a universalism associated with that. There's a definite exclusion, and it's pretty bloody obvious. On the communist front, though, and this is maybe what made it such a powerful substitute in some sense for Christianity, there was the notion that what we were working for was the universal brotherhood of man and this intense inclusiveness where everyone could live together peacefully. And so people were also led down the garden path by that presumption and found out that lying in the service of future utopia turns out to be a pathway to hell, just like lying in the service of an exclusionary fascist state.
Right. I was sitting in a Russian family's apartment in Moscow when I was in Russia reporting the book. And I'd spent the last prior 3 days out visiting the monument for the dead from political violence and hearing just incredible stories of atrocities and suffering. And I was sitting there my last night in Moscow having dinner with the family, and I said at the beginning, I just don't understand how anybody could have believed what the Bolsheviks were preaching. The father at the head of the table, these were all Orthodox Christians who were anti-communist. But he said, you don't know how people did this? Let me tell you. And then he goes on this long discourse about 300 years of Russian history, about incredible exploitation and cruelty by the czars, by the ruling class, even by the church. And he said by the time you got to the end of the 19th century, when people began to lose faith in the established order, people were ready to believe anything that gave them a sense of relief. And then the father ended by saying, look, I'm not saying the Bolsheviks were right. They were evil. But you can see where they came from. And I think, going forward to our own time, when you live in a situation as we do today in the West, where people are radically atomized, there's this deep disrespect and casting over of hierarchies and institutions, when you have people who want to transgress for the sake of transgression, and so on and so forth. All of these are points that Hannah Arendt said were precursors to totalitarianism. Well, it's no wonder that people, otherwise intelligent people, are willing to accept insane ideological ideas because they think somehow they're convinced that this is going to bring about a better world.
Well, it's also the case, I think, that we all bear the burden of, in some sense, original sin in relationship to the atrocities of the past. And the left has been very good at weaponizing this. And so when we're accused in our Western privilege of unjustly benefiting from the conditions of our birth, there's some truth in that, and there's some truth in the claim that those unjust conditions were purchased